I speak to you in the name of the Creator, the Redeemer, and the Sanctifier.
Amen.
So I don't know about you, but since Queen Elizabeth died, I have spent way too much time watching TV and reading all the pomp and circumstance that's going on in England. And it all reminded me of a trip that I took with my daughter Jennifer many, many years ago to England. Now, for those of you who don't know, I grew up in Boston. So I took the T, which is the transit, the train, into Boston all the time. School, pleasure, work. In Boston, when the train comes through, it's very close to the edge. So in London, however, there's a gap, and it's fairly large. So every time a train comes into the station, and I wish I had an English accent, but I don't, there's an announcement that says, "Mind the gap." I still have a souvenir magnet on my refrigerator from that trip, and it had to be 20 years ago. Now, it would be all too easy to get caught in that gap and stumble if someone isn't paying attention. It's a good thing they reminded me every single time. Now today, we hear cautionary tales in our Hebrew reading from Amos, Paul's letter to Timothy, and then in our gospel. And all three caution that wealth is difficult, can be difficult to manage. Nowhere does it say wealth is bad. But wealth can create a gap between those who are wealthy and those who are not. So it's the haves and the have-nots. So wealth isn't a bad thing, depending on how you manage it. Let's look first at the prophet Amos. Amos was living around 750 BC. He was a shepherd, and he raised sycamore trees, or cared for sycamore trees. I don't know how you raise a tree. Time and time again, when he was taking his goods to market, he witnessed the injustice of the rich over the poor, those with power and those without any power, without any voice. Amos had a series of God dreams, and then warned those in power, the keepers of the gap, that those who take care only of themselves in luxury and ignoring the poor were not following God's will, and God would send them into exile, into the gap. They were living the prosperity gospel, believing they were rich because they deserved to be. They were faithful with their ritualistic offerings and their obligations, and they believed those brought them divine favor. The poor, of course, were poor because they didn't do these things. Of course, they probably couldn't do these things. Amos tells them that they're deceiving themselves if they think God cares about their rituals and not their lack of care for the poor. Going to church, going to temple, going to any place to worship, that alone does not put anyone right with God. Worshiping God is a means of loving our neighbor and caring for our fellow human beings. Of course, they didn't believe Amos. They were exiled. Amos's focus is on injustice going on around him, the gap between those who worked for justice and those who did not. Amos knew, and we know, that everyone is equal in God's sight. God brings justice to the unethical status quo. God does mind the gap. Turning to Paul's letter to Timothy, we heard, "But those who want to be rich fall into temptation and are trapped by many senseless, harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction." Trapped, plunged, destruction. Sounds like things we want to avoid. Paul tells Timothy and his growing community to avoid destruction by being content with having enough. It is all too easy to spend our time gaining wealth only to find ourselves going away from God. Paul reminds us we came into this world with nothing, and we will leave this world with nothing. And you've no doubt heard the saying, you can't take it with you. While we are on this earth, we should fight the good fight and do what we are called to do. And as Paul said, pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, gentleness. Now, the major theme in Luke's gospel is our believing in Jesus means that we will take care of the poor. Last week, our gospel began with the exact same words as today. There was a rich man. And last week ended with the words, you cannot serve God and wealth. He continues that theme today with the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. The rich man in today's gospel is not named. His wealth is not the issue in the gospel, in the parable. Only what he chose to do with that wealth. He concerned himself with how lavishly he could live, and he didn't care about Lazarus or anyone outside of his gate. Lazarus, by the way, is the only person that actually has a name in any of Jesus' parables. It's such a stark contrast between the rich, lavish man with the purple robe and the poor man, Lazarus. So Lazarus just sat by the gate at the rich man's home. Picture a nice gated community. We've all either lived in them or seen them, driven by them. The rich stay inside and keep the poor outside. The rich man kept himself separate from the ragtag, the sick, the poor people, such as Lazarus, who were outside his gate. And in those days, the belief was that if someone was poor, they're being punished because of some sin of theirs or their parents. So why pay attention to someone like Lazarus? Why open that gate? And why look at what's on the other side? It's a difficult story to hear, isn't it? How could someone be so callous to someone they presumably see every day? Is it that difficult for us to imagine? I'm afraid not. We see people like Lazarus on the street. We often think that the person is there because they've done something wrong, they have a mental illness, they're lazy, they have a problem with drugs or alcohol. The perception is they must have done something or they wouldn't be in the situation they are in. And when we make assumptions with another's need or lifestyle, we are acting as the rich man and the Pharisees. As Christians, we're asked to look at everyone as a child of God, just as we know that we are children of God. Now, many people here are involved in lots and lots of ministries, and we do what we can to attend to the Lazaruses around us. We bring food kits for Square One. We clean the environment through Green and Fit. We support an Afghan refugee family. We visit those in jail. We donate coats and boots, and we vote so that our voices are heard in order to alleviate the suffering around us. And I'm sure by now you all know that my favorite is the Big Blue Drop-In Center, where we engage in conversation. Having a conversation is helpful to gauge what a person is really looking for. Sometimes people simply want to be heard. We want to hear their stories. It's the main reason that the drop-in center exists downstairs in the cathedral. We want to give people a safe place to tell their stories. We want people to have a sense of dignity while telling their stories. Now, there are certainly some needs we can meet, some needs we can't meet. There are things we can control, and there are things that are out of our control. But what we can do is open the gates wider in all of our lives and look with compassion on those who are kept on the outside, those out sitting on the bench. Can we look at Lazarus, a person in need, the same way that we would look at our favorite friend and do for Lazarus what we would do for that favorite friend? The gap is widening every day, and we are being asked to find the gaps in our lives and do something to stop the gap from becoming a chasm. Jesus issues an invitation to step forward, open the gate, and care for all those he loves. Jesus is the gate. And as we are more and more responsive to the pain, the hunger, and the hopes of those we meet ourselves in our own humanity. Amen.